Hello, scholars! My name is Dr. Kara Stillen, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we talked about the Cold War and the arms race between the U.S. and Russia. This video focuses on the economic state of the U.S. as well as civil rights. So let's begin. After the end of World War II, the nation struggled to shift back to non-war production, but quickly found its momentum. Due to the fact that workers had hundreds of hours of overtime pay from wartime efforts, many had saved their money to the tune of $37 billion for a time when there wouldn't be shortages and they could spend whatever they made. The demand for cars and appliances were quite high, and workers ramped up their efforts to meet this demand. For the next 15 years after World War II ended, the U.S. experienced an enormous growth within its economy. In addition to the increased demand for products, the Cold War with Russia meant the government spent more money on military supplies. This need for military supplies and products stimulated the U.S. economy even more. In 1950, Americans bought 6 million cars, and its GNP was 50% higher than a decade previously. The U.S. became involved in Korea in the late 1940s and early 1950s and spent about $40 billion on planes, ammunition, guns, and other military supplies each year. In addition to unprecedented economic growth for a decade and a half after World War II, there was also a baby boom in which a substantial population of couples gave birth and increased the number of children in their families. The growth of suburbia was substantial, and the need for 2 cars was often necessary. In many states in the U.S. in 1955, gas sold for about 30 cents a gallon. The other hot item that a majority of individuals wanted was a television set. The 1950s were a time when television sets were sold to families all across the nation. The 1950s also brought about the first computers and machines that were used in businesses. Electronic devices were added to automobiles, ships, planes, and also trains. Those industries that focused in electronics did really well during this time. Locations with older factories did not always fare well. Agriculture did not fare as well as other industries. Bumper crops brought about lower prices, so farmers did not do as well as what they were hoping. Overall, workers did quite well in the U.S. They received decent pay, worked 40 hours a week, very few had to work on the weekends, and many received a 2-week vacation every single year. From 1945 to 1960, disposable income went from $500 to $1,800. This was the highest standard of living in the world within the 1950s. Academics didn't know how to describe suburbia in the 1950s. The term middle class arose during this time because the poor and the rich didn't inhabit suburbia. It was strange that both blue-collar and white-collar workers both lived in suburbia, which meant lawyers, doctors, salespersons, and plumbers all lived in similar neighborhoods. Most of those living in suburbia were now labeled as white and Christian. In addition to the growing suburbs, the need for highways and expressways increased as well. The number of shopping malls went from maybe 10 in the nation in 1945 to hundreds within 10 to 15 years. The home was the focus for individuals and their activities. Americans sought homes in suburbia because they wanted lots of space, the newest kitchen appliances, nice countertops, and private bedrooms for their children. There were times when men made their garages into large game rooms. As couples moved into the suburbs, they started families of their own, where extended families were not always involved in the childbearing that had been in the past. Families were of the utmost importance in the 1950s, but organized religion came in a second. Families tended to identify themselves through their significant religions. Family groups were either Protestant, Catholics, or Jews. There were smaller populations of individuals that joined more fundamentalist religions. New churches sprung up all over the suburbs, and when baby boom children needed to go to school, the public school system was extremely overwhelmed. They asked the federal government for assistance in building more schools and hiring teachers, but the federal government basically ignored their pleas. Not only did the amount of children going to public school increase, but the amount of students attending college increased from 1.5 million to 3.6 million in 20 years. When television became popular in the 1950s, Americans read less newspapers and magazines. They even listened to radios less often. By the time the 1950s came, there were 3 television networks that existed that were on the air. These networks gained money from advertisers that pre-taped commercials that could be aired at the beginning, during, and after network programs. Studio One, the Goodyear Television Playhouse, and Playhouse 90 were some of the first programs featured on television sets. Early television programs had very small studios that used cameras to show close-ups on paid actors. Viewers sought entertainment in the realms of comedy, adventure, and action. Those that watched loved additional programs like The Untouchables or Bonanza. There was definitely a counterculture that existed during the 1950s. They were known as the Beats, and they pushed back against consumerism within the United States. Jack Kerouac wrote a book which was used by the counterculture as their direction for their movement. The book was called On the Road. The ideas of this book had some backing in Buddhism. Those that considered themselves beatniks usually had long hair, wore strange clothing, often took drugs, and had relations with many different people. In the art community, there was a rise of abstract expressionism, which was a sign of individuality and a movement away from conformity. President Eisenhower's administration didn't really focus on social or economic reform. He wanted to see the budget limited in all respects, but also believed in the separation of powers and stayed away from the legislative branch. Eisenhower was able to extend Social Security benefits to 7 million Americans, increased minimum wage, and gave additional benefits to the unemployed. He also helped to pass the Highway Act of 1956. This meant Congress would give funding for 40,000 miles of interstate highways to be developed across the country from major city to major city. Once the highways and interstates were built, thousands of people benefited from them. Travel time was substantially shortened and profits were increased for those that could now move products more quickly. While America developed its local structure and tried to convince the world of its superiority within democracy, the Soviet Union continued to focus on the manner in which the U.S. treated its Black Americans. How could America claim to be free, fair, and democratic when Black Americans were continuously being discriminated against and treated as if they weren't human? Black Americans in the South still lived in segregated communities. They worked lower-paying jobs and continuously were made to feel as though they were not fully American due to gross inequalities. Conditions in the South continued to be worse for Blacks than in the North. There were separate schools, public facilities, telephone booths, and waiting rooms that were all segregated. Truman decided to strengthen the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. This division would begin challenging school segregation and restrictions given housing. The next movement would push for the desegregation of the armed forces. The NAACP worked diligently to segregate graduate and professional schools first. They then turned to the desegregation of public schools. The NAACP also worked to challenge the original Separate but Equal Clause, the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which would show the psychological damage to African Americans and how this decision violated the 14th Amendment. They did this by introducing the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka case, which eventually brought an end to separate but equal as constitutional. Even though the law changed, it wouldn't mean that states and local governments would follow those rules. States in the Deep South had enormous trouble with desegregation laws. Pupil placement laws were passed by school boards and officials that gave them the ability to send certain students to particular schools based on intelligence, morals, and ability to adjust. Many different disputes were brought to courts concerning these new laws. But by the end of the 1950s, less than 1% of African Americans were actually attending schools with white in the Deep South. When President Eisenhower didn't say anything after the Supreme Court's ruling, many Americans thought his silence meant that he was okay with segregation. Eisenhower decided to fight against segregation in the District of Columbia school system in the Navy yards and in the federal facilities. In 1957, the Little Rock Central High School stated it would not allow Black students to enter the all-white public school. Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas called in the state's National Guards to prevent the students from entering the school. President Eisenhower reacted by sending 1,000 paratroopers to ensure the 9 Black students could attend Central High School for the next couple of years. This federal action made a strong stand against segregation. The individuals that made the most significant change during this time were African Americans themselves. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white person on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, this was not the first time she'd done this, and it was an act of protest against segregation within the South. Parks was part of the NAACP chapter, and Black leaders called for the boycott of the city's bus system until the rule was discontinued. Black women organized themselves and handed out 50,000 plus leaflets to get other Black individuals to be part of the boycott. Carpools were organized, and within 1 year, the buses had to get rid of their segregation rules. One of the leaders of the Montgomery Bus Boycott was Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. helped to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to protest against various forms of segregation. King led a prayer pilgrimage to Washington, where a crowd of 30,000 individuals pushed to stop the tactics that were trying to keep Black Americans from voting. Martin Luther King Jr. told protesters that when they were cursed at, to not curse back, and if they were struck with violence, to not strike back with violence. He believed that if change would come, it would have to come from love and seeing people pushing violence against others who were not pushing that violence back. In 1960, students learned and listened to the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr., and in Greensboro, North Carolina, Black students sat down at a lunch counter and refused to move until they were given service. Students across the nation took their lead and protested with sit-ins, kneel-ins, and wade-ins in swimming pools. Within 1 year, the desegregation of hundreds of public facilities in hundreds of southern cities took place because of more than 50,000 protesters. The movement gained strength, and eventually the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was formed in April of 1960. Okay, well that is it for this video. In the next video, we're going to look at the 1960s and some of its interesting events. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please click that like button. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will talk with you soon. Thanks for watching.